All right, so once again, our lungs are positioned within our rib cage. You know that they're around our heart. So on either side of the sternum, left side, right side, and that their inferior level is going to be around, like I said, rib pair 7, and they're going to be bordered by our diaphragm. The fact that they are butted right up against our diaphragm tells us that if we move the diaphragm down, that means we're going to increase the volume of the lungs. If we push the diaphragm up, that is going to help us push air out of the lungs, okay? All right, so we also know that the right lung is larger because it does not have to deal with the heart. And because of that, it also gives us space for a third lobe. So we're going to have 3 lobar bronchi on the right. We have 2 lobar bronchi on the left. The left lung, we also have to have a space that we're going to call the cardiac notch. Now, in both of these, we're going to have what we're going to call the hilum, which is basically going to be the region where all of the blood vessels and the primary bronchus are going to live, okay? So the primary bronchus and the pulmonary arteries and pulmonary veins are going to basically exit the lungs at this region that we're going to call the hilum. If you think about this as basically being like a black-eyed pea, the hilum is going to be the eye of the black-eyed pea, okay? So in those regions, like I said, we have the main bronchus, we have the pulmonary artery, which is always going to be blue, and the pulmonary vein, which is always going to be red. Which direction is the blood flowing through the pulmonary artery? Away from the heart or towards the heart? Away. So remember, the right ventricle pushes deoxygenated blood through the pulmonary arteries into the lungs so that it can be oxygenated. So the pulmonary veins will return that oxygenated blood through our pulmonary veins. We have 2 on each side. Okay, so we're going to have 2 pulmonary veins on both the right and the left. And those return blood to which chamber of the heart? The left atrium. Okay. Now, the divisions in between these, we are going to call fissures. If it is running at an oblique angle, these will be called the oblique fissures. So we have an oblique fissure both on the left and the right. On the right lung, we also have what we're going to call the horizontal fissure, sorry, because it's running horizontally. Okay, so horizontal fissure, oblique fissure. The left, we only have an oblique fissure. Now, we also have segments within each lung. So these segments are, of course, going to be fed by the segmented bronchi. Okay, so if we split into lobar bronchi, where we're going to have a lobar bronchus for each lobe of the lung, it makes sense then that for every segment or segmented bronchus that we're going to have a segment of the lung. Okay, now you do not have to be able to label all of these segments of the lung. I just wanted you to see that we can actually follow each of those segmented bronchi to a specific place on each lung. Okay, you are welcome. Keep in mind that I could, and it would be considered fair game. So, yeah, that's what I thought. All right, so now we get into the pulmonary circulation, because once again, the whole point of the respiratory system is getting oxygen into that blood that we are pumping around with our heart. Okay, now, is the blood that is moving through the lungs moving faster or slower than the blood that is moving through the aorta? Or does it have as much pressure as the blood that is moving through the aorta? No. Pulmonary circulation is slower and is dealing with much lower pressures. Okay. A big part of that is the fact that the distance is a lot smaller. We're talking a few inches rather than multiple feet, like we're talking about with systemic circulation. So we're dealing with much lower pressures here. This also gives us more time. Okay. Slower pressures also means slower flow of blood, which means they're going to spend more time in these capillaries. And if they're spending more time in the capillaries, what is happening? We're getting more what in? Oxygen. We're having more oxygen bind to our hemoglobins here, okay, by letting them take a little bit more time. Okay, so you will, though, need to memorize the path of the blood. So when the blood leaves the right ventricle, it's going to go through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary what? Pulmonary trunk into the pulmonary what's? Left and right pulmonary arteries. And then finally, these are going to go into branches of the pulmonary artery, so the little arterioles, okay? Those arterioles will lead down into our pulmonary capillaries, okay? Our pulmonary capillaries are going to be around our different little alveoli, okay? After pulmonary capillaries, they're going to enter pulmonary venules, and then finally, pulmonary veins, and then finally into the pulmonary veins, left atrium, then finally out and deal with cardiovascular stuff, okay? So that kind of is our pathway. Now, it also makes sense that because we are breathing air in, and goodness only knows what is in the air that we are breathing, we also have lots of lymph vessels and lymph nodes associated with our lungs. These are going to be in the pleura, which are basically going to be those membranes on either side of our lungs, okay? So both on the parietal pleura, kind of basically on the insides of our ribs, as well as the visceral pleura touching the surface of the lungs. This is where we're going to find most of those lymph nodes, okay, as well as around some of our bronchi. These are going to be very important in helping us get rid of any excess fluid, okay? So remember, we have to humidify the air as we are breathing it in. So we need to get rid of some of that excess fluid and be able to get rid of it, okay? So we use our lymph vessels to help us do that. We also have white blood vessels living in our lymph nodes, which can make sure that we don't inhale things that can kill us, or at least kill it before it has a chance. Also, vagus nerve is involved here, okay? The vagus nerve deals with the larynx. We're also dealing with some sympathetic input from some of our thoracic nerves. But once again, vagus nerve is involved because the vagus nerve does everything. All right, now we do have pleural membranes here, remember. So we have the parietal pleura, which is going to be on the outside of the cavity, right? Parietal is the outside of the cavity. Visceral pleura is going to be on the inside of the cavities. So pleura means lungs. So it's the visceral pleura is going to be the synovial membrane that is touching the surface of the lungs. If you've ever heard of a pneumothorax, here's that definition if you wanted to read about these things. I'm just trying not to spend too much time on it. All right, so now let's go ahead and look at the mechanism of breathing so that next time we can come in, refresh our memories on it a little bit. And then we're going to do some breathing exercises, or at least look at some volumes. All right, so the two main gases that we are trying to exchange here are CO2 and oxygen, okay? Which means we are trying to get CO2-rich air out, and we're trying to breathe in oxygen-rich air. So this is basically just kind of an overview of this kind of respiratory process. So our tissues undergoing metabolism, doing things, they are breaking down sugars. The sugars that you break down in your tissues get turned into CO2. The sugars that you break down during metabolism get turned into CO2. Did I say that the oxygen you breathe in gets turned into CO2? No, never, ever, ever, ever equate those two things. They are different. They come from different places. They do different things. The CO2 has virtually nothing to do with the oxygen, okay? If you put a little like radioactive tag on the oxygen molecules and have someone breathe them in, they do not come out attached to a carbon as CO2, okay? So instead, they get breathed out as water. The oxygen you breathed in, the oxygen that you breathe in to help us do metabolism and things gets turned into water. It does not get turned into CO2. Your food gets turned into CO2. Okay, so sugars, fats, proteins, those things get turned into CO2. Okay, sorry, that's just a pet peeve of mine. So it's very important that you understand that. Okay, oxygen does not get turned into CO2. Does oxygen get turned into CO2?
Yes.
It does not. Okay. All right. So the whole idea here then is that in our lungs, so in our alveoli, we can move oxygen from the outside environment where we have a lot of it outside. We can then move that into the blood so that then that oxygen-rich blood goes down to the tissues where then oxygen leaves the blood. So we now have blood that is oxygen poor, but then CO2-rich tissues are going to drop off some of that excess CO2 and they're going to drop it into the blood. So our blood then becomes deoxygenated and CO2 rich. The blood that moves to your tissues is CO2 poor and oxygen rich. Okay, so that means we have two different not pathways, two different chemicals that are going to be moving across these membranes. Okay, so oxygen rich blood moves down and oxygen poor blood moves back. CO2 poor blood moves to your tissue, CO2 rich blood moves back. Okay, both of these though do get exchanged in your lungs, and we call that pulmonary ventilation. Now, whenever we are breathing, we have lots and lots of muscles associated with it. Okay, it's not just our diaphragm. Okay, now, whenever you are just sitting here, breathing quietly, minding your own business, not doing anything particularly difficult, you're going to be breathing using two sets of muscles. You breathe using your diaphragm and your external intercostals. So the external intercostals, external tells us outside, intercostals tells us it's in between our ribs. Okay, so because they're on the outside, when those muscles contract, which direction are your ribs going to move, in or out? They're on the outside, so they're going to move your ribs out. Okay, so when you breathe in, we need to have something happen. Or in order to breathe in, we need to have something happen. We can't exert pressure on the outside environment. So in order for us to pull air in, okay, in order for us to pull air in, we have to create a vacuum or create a lower pressure in our thoracic cavity than we have in the outside environment. And the air will then move in to fill that void and equalize the pressures on either side. Okay, so what we have to do here then is we need to make our thoracic cavity larger. Okay, so say this is our thoracic cavity. I guess I'll draw it with a little bit more. Okay, okay, so here is our thoracic cavity. At rest, or like if nothing is happening and air is not moving one way or the other, we're going to have equal pressures here and here. So inside and outside, the pressures are going to be the same. Okay, now in order for us to inhale, that means we need air to move from the outside inside, which means we need to make this volume larger. Okay, so in order to inhale, we need to pull these lines out. Okay, so we're going to do that using our external intercostals, so the muscles in between our ribs, and this muscle right here. Anyone remember what this one's called? Our diaphragm. This is one of those muscles I can never remember how to spell. For the life of me, it just like is a blank spot in my brain where I can never remember it. Because I keep wanting to say like diagram. This is what happens when you take too many math classes. All right, for those interested, I took Cal 1, Cal 2, and Cal 3 as an undergraduate. I took Calculus 3 for fun. Why? I needed 4 hours to be a full-time student. So it was either take some stupid humanities that did not matter and then like something like bowling, or I could take a class that was actually entertaining like Calculus 3. So I took Calculus 3 and it was a very fun class. It was also the hardest class I've ever had in my entire life. It's the only class where I've ever felt like I might not be smart enough. That's because there was one equation I never figured out how to, or it took me 3 weeks to figure out how to use it correctly. And by then the class was way ahead of me and I was like, this is bad. But I eventually figured it out and passed. It was tough. The teacher made fun of me even. Because I was a biology major. First day of class, he literally says like, okay, raise your hand for if you are an engineering major. Like half the class raised their hand. It's like, okay. All right. Put your hands down. It's like, okay, raise your hand if you're a math major. Raise your hands like, okay, y'all keep your hands raised. Engineers, find one of these people, make them your friends. Without it, you will not pass this class. And then he looked at me, he's like, you didn't raise your hand. What are you? He's like, biology. He's like, oh, you poor soul. And it was rough. It was fun. I learned a lot. Like all of those like geometry formulas and stuff that you learn, like for volumes and surface areas and all those kinds of things. We figured out how to derive those specifically, like within calculus and like this. Yeah, it was fun. I enjoyed it. Anyway, so our diaphragm is what we are going to use to manipulate the size of this primarily. Your intercostals, like, so everybody take a deep breath in. Did you feel your ribs move very much? No, they did move, but not a lot. Okay, so most then of those pressure changes that we're going to be moving around are going to come from our diaphragm. Okay, so your diaphragm is basically going to be this large muscle that's going to sit underneath your ribs. However, when your diaphragm depresses and it comes down here, that means this can then come down here, right? Well, this dotted line, would you say that encapsulates a larger volume or a smaller volume than this one right here, than the solid line? It's a larger volume. Well, larger volume means lower pressure. You have made a small vacuum. When you turn on your vacuum, which direction does the air move? Into it, right? So when we make a little vacuum right here, that is going to force air from the outside environment where it now is at a higher pressure into down here where it is now at a lower pressure until they are equal. So that is how we pull air in. We depress our diaphragm, raises the volume, and bam, air comes in. The opposite is also true. We can close this. Okay, so when you breathe out just in regular expiration, okay, we don't even have to contract any muscles during regular expiration. We just relax this and let it go back to its resting state, and just relaxing the diaphragm is enough to help to make this volume smaller, and then relaxing these rib muscles returns it back to its resting place, and then that is what's going to kind of push air out under relaxed circumstances. Okay, now, so y'all have all kind of been sitting here breathing normally. Everybody take a huge deep breath in. Pull as much air in as you possibly can, while paying special attention to any feelings that you have kind of in your chest cavity. Like, where do you feel things moving when you take in a deep breath? Where do you feel things moving? Muscles. Shoulders. You're feeling muscles here. What are you doing? You're raising your top of your ribs, making your cavity larger. What else? Your ribs. You can feel your ribs opening. All right. So up in your muscles, you have your sternocleidomastoids. These help pull up on the sternum and the clavicles, raising that area, making space for your ribs to move. Then you have some smaller muscles behind those, kind of towards the back of your neck here. We call these scalenes. That's these little guys right here. Okay. So these are the scalenes. These, once again, elevate those ribs, making the cavity larger. Larger cavity, more air moves in. Okay. We also have these serratus muscles, which are going to be in our back. Okay. We have the erector spinae, also in our back. All of these. So these are actually even going to kind of pull the thoracic vertebrae backwards a little bit. All of this in name of getting as much air as we can into that cavity. We make the opening as big as we can. The bigger opening, what air, like what happens to the air? If we make a bigger opening, do we get more air or less air? More air, okay? Now, that is where we're gonna get more air. So if we then relax all of those muscles, that's going to help us close those cavities back off and push those airs out, okay? So everybody just kind of go back to normal breathing. All right, now after a normal exhale, now I want you to push as much air as you possibly can out. Do you feel muscles moving? Which muscles do you feel moving when you're trying to get rid of as much air as you can? Your stomach. All right, so your obliques, both your external obliques and your transverse abdominis. Those are those muscles in your stomach you're feeling, okay? We also have our internal intercostal. So in this case, now we have the opposite side of muscles. Now we're talking muscles on the inside of our rib cage. These are now moving, okay? So because these muscles are now moving, we have another problem, okay? Or not another problem. We're once again pushing things closed. So if we go back to this diagram here, forced expiration, that's to say us pushing out as much air as we possibly can. We can now make this cavity even smaller, okay? A normal breath in, though, we normally don't do that. That's why it's called forced expiration. So we now have different volumes that we can deal with. We have normal respiratory volume, which is here, right? Normal respiratory volume. We now have a volume under forced inhalation, and we now have a volume under forced expiration, or what we're going to call a reserve volume, that no matter how much force you push on these things and how lightheaded you want to get, there will still be some air in your lungs. This is to make sure that your lungs do not deflate, and us taking all those pieces of wet paper and sticking them together where they can't get unstuck, okay? So we need to maintain some amount of volume here. And it's going to be these volumes and stuff that we're going to mess with next time, okay? let's not talk about yawns.
No.
No.
Okay.
That's like talking about fungi last time, where it's just like, this, yeah, it gets very hand wavy when we start talking about yawns. So that's because there's a lot of things that can go into that. Sometimes they're important, sometimes they're not. You can hear some arguments of, okay, they're actually trying to cool off air. Like there's lots of weirdness that's involved with yawns. Less weirdness than fungi, because fungi are just effing strange. But yeah. All right, so here's some pictures kind of showing you what's happening during each of these types of deals. But we'll talk a little bit more about that next time. And just real quick, I am going to talk to you about some gas laws, but really it just means whenever you have an increased volume, you have decreased pressure. In decreased volume, you have increased pressure. So if, say we squeeze right here, so we take all of the air here that is in our lungs and we push it down into this much smaller area, we now have a much higher pressure. When you put air under pressure, it wants to escape. So now if the air is at high pressure here and low pressure here, what happens to that air? It goes out, okay? Air is always going to move from high pressure to low pressure until those things are equal. So you're going to push out enough air that all of a sudden it will equal the whatever kilopascals of pressure of air is on the stuff that's on the outside, okay? And that is actually all also going to depend on the pressures of air or of the air that is around you. If you go breathe somewhere where the air is at a lower pressure, you have to work harder to get volumes of air in. So even just walking around at 5,000 feet, or especially at 10,000 feet, just walking around in order to get the volume of oxygen in, or the number of necessary oxygen molecules to your tissues, you'll find that even just walking around, you'll have to do forced inspiration, just like you would if you were running at sea level. Okay, just to get the true, like the number of oxygens in that are necessary, even though your oxygen requirements are staying the same. So that just kind of talks to you about some of those pressure numbers. And if you wanted to see what some of the differences are, they're pretty small as far as like pressure of like millimeters mercury. We're not dealing with massive pressure differences, but we can deal with pretty large volume differences. Okay, so we can see what some of these numbers are if you wanted to take a look at those, but we'll talk about those next time. So we're pretty much done for today because I know I've had to do a bunch of talking. Next time we'll get to do some running. I just wanted to introduce the concept so that next time we can actually look at some of these volumes and have some time to do that. And next time we'll do some experiments with you as well. You don't have to do the running if you don't want, but it will be more fun if you do. Out of curiosity, is anyone in here an athlete, like on a softball team or anything like that? No? Damn.
Yeah.
But not right now? Okay, it matters. So yours will still be a little higher than average, but it won't be as high. Like if you find, like I actually had someone that was in cross country in one of the classes one time. It's like, oh, you're gonna be fun. And their volumes are just like 2 or 3 times what people were.
Have a good one.
You as well. See y'all next time. I promise we have lab activities next time.